सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
In this edition of Global Print, dear viewer, I'm going to talk to you about a self-confident India led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and an India which is the chair of the G20 this year, and lots happening on that front. And an India that's confronting the West, and we've seen remarks by External Affairs Minister Jaishankar a few days ago challenging the remarks by the spokespersons of the US and Germany. Now, let me clarify, he didn't directly castigate either of these two spokespersons, but he was very, very eloquent in what he said a few days ago in Bangalore. But before I continue on my explanation and my analysis of what's going on in the Modi government about its relationship with the Western nations, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do subscribe, pay just a little bit for ThePrint's free, fair, objective, and unhyphenated journalism. You know, these are not just words for us. They really do mean a lot. And we have used these as our benchmarks to give you the best journalism that we can, that we are able to, not just for these last many weeks and months, but these last few years before the pandemic and since. So do pay that very small sum of money you have as a subscriber, benefits and privileges that non-subscribers don't have. Now, back to my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, which I do hope you will read. And I titled this column of mine, and I've called it, "Why is a Self-Confident India Confronting the West? Read these signs from US to Germany." Now, just to give you some background, what happened was a week or so ago, about 10 days or so ago, you know that Rahul Gandhi was disqualified as a member of parliament from Wayanad by the Lok Sabha Secretariat in the wake of a Surat court ruling that he should be censured for his remarks that he made in 2019, and particularly for a phrase where he said that do men with Modi as the last surname, are they all thieves? The Surat court took huge objection to that. Mr. Gandhi was censured. He was punished. Now, since then, he has appealed, of course, and his sentence has been suspended. It's been put in abeyance. But no matter, the damage has been done. He has been disqualified as a Lok Sabha MP. And in reaction to that, there was a statement, a suo motu statement, let me add, by the US State Department in Washington, D.C. And they basically said that they're watching how this thing develops. They didn't say very much. They didn't castigate or censure the Modi government, but they basically said that we're watching how the democratic process unfolds in India. Then, a few days later, was the German spokesperson, and she, in answer to a question, so that's the difference between the US and the German statements. The German one came in answer to a question by a journalist where he said, does Germany have a reaction to what's going on in India vis-a-vis the Rahul Gandhi disqualification? And the German spokesperson also very carefully read and noted that Germany was watching closely what was going on in that case, and it hoped that the rule of law and, other judicial matters according to the constitution, that kind of thing. So it wasn't like an open attack or anything on the Modi government. But what happened as a result of that, and let me read to you in full what External Affairs Minister Mr. Jaishankar, he was speaking at a program organized by two BJP MPs, Tejasvi Surya and PC Mohan. And here is what Mr. Jaishankar said. The West, he said, has a bad habit of commenting on others. They somehow think it is some kind of God-given right. They will have to learn only by experience that if you keep doing this, other people will also start commenting, and they will not like it when they see that happening. And I see this happening, he concluded. Now, you wonder what this is all about and what makes Jaishankar a former diplomat, not just any ordinary diplomat, but a former foreign secretary, the top job in the Indian Foreign Service, a very, very important job. He's held some of the most interesting assignments that anyone can have across their career. He was ambassador in China, he was ambassador to the US, he's a Russian speaking officer. He has rubbed shoulders with the high and mighty. So, as Shashi Tharoor, the Congress MP from Thiruvananthapuram and also the head of the External Affairs Standing Committee in Parliament, said subsequently in reaction to Jaishankar's remarks, and he said, I want to tell my friend Jay to cool it a bit and not to have such thin skin. And that's exactly my point. Why is Jaishankar demonstrating that India has such a thin skin? Now, there are a couple of points that I'd like to make here. Is it just Jaishankar who is demonstrating thin skin, or is he speaking on behalf of a government, on behalf of Prime Minister Modi, which of course he is, because he's a card-carrying member of Prime Minister Modi's cabinet, very much part of the CCS, the Cabinet Committee on Security. So here he is saying these things about the West, when in fact India is leading the charge of the G20. Now, a few score meetings have already taken place. The foreign ministers of the G20, no less, met a month ago in Delhi. The summit will take place in September, where all the leaders of the G20, including the US President Joe Biden, the Russian President Vladimir Putin, and the other leaders will assemble in Delhi and talk about how to take this forward. And remember that India is global, representing the global south. But that's another point. I'm not going to get into the politics of the G20 in this edition of Global Print. But only to say that here is India leading the G20, which means that India is leading the world in a sense. If it's only because it's the mantle of the presidency has fallen in India. But having said that, it is doing a good job as well as it can. It is leading the world's 20 large economies, which means that it's very much part of the global system. It's a globalizing power. It's integrated into the world system. Prime Minister Modi is likely to go to France and the US in a few months' time. So isn't that a bit crazy, dear viewer? On the one hand, you have Mr. Jaishankar, who is being so critical about the West. And on the other hand, you are flying to all these big world capitals and demonstrating and showing the world that you are very much part of this world. So this contradiction in terms, which is mind-boggling in a sense, I'm totally nonplussed by it. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about this. Now, the bigger question is, why would Prime Minister Modi, who is leading the charge of the G20, much beloved of his people, there is no other political leader that comes close to the Prime Minister's popularity and his ratings. He has done well. He has taken in, he's walking India on this very narrow tortuous middle path between Russia and the West on Ukraine, for example. India has come off COVID, which was a horrible nightmare while it lasted. The economy is not doing so well, but again, the Prime Minister has been trying very hard to steer it away from the shoals. A $1.4 billion population, a 1.4 billion people, the largest, most populous country now in the world, overtaken China. Why is the Prime Minister, why is India and the Prime Minister who represents India abroad, why is he allowing these comments to be made by his own External Affairs Minister? So let me also point out to you that some very influential foreign policy analysts, including those who have written in ThePrint, have said that that India should actually become much closer to the West. They haven't used the word ally, but remember the phrase natural ally, that India is a natural ally of the US, is as old as Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And this is when Prime Minister Vajpayee had made a trip to the US a few years after the nuclear tests, which of course had been sanctioned by the Americans. Now, the question today is, and some of these foreign policy analysts are saying, that India should make an effort to become much closer to the West. And they use the Russian invasion of Ukraine as an example and argue that India should be much more vocal about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and be much more critical about Vladimir Putin. But I want to say this as a response. First of all, what is really surprising is that some of these foreign policy analysts who actually pride themselves on belonging to the school of ultimate realism in foreign policy, in strategic affairs, they are the ones who are advocating that India take this high moral ground and adopt this high moral ground vis-a-vis the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So all these years, these analysts have been saying, no, India should be much more realistic in its foreign policy posture, must abandon this moral high ground that it has always talked about, backed by a 5,000-year-old, very ancient civilization. So today, for these self-same people to say, hey, listen, we should return to our moral values and be critical of the invader. I mean, first of all, there's rich irony in that. But second of all, let's examine this prospect. Should India have been much more critical of the Russian government and of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin himself? Yes, you can argue that in this day and age, nobody invades another country. And in fact, you can say even in 1965, so that's more than 50 years ago, when Pakistan and India went to war, it was Pakistan that started the war. India retaliated, defended its territory. Not just that, it took territory. It took the Hajipir Pass. But after that, after the talks and negotiations that took place in Tashkent subsequently, India returned the territory it had taken. So in today's day and age, if Russia has invaded Ukraine, has occupied the territory, especially in the eastern region, in the Donbass region, then what happens? Even if talks are held, even if peace is held, should Russia keep that territory or should it belong to an independent and sovereign Ukraine? I think we are jumping the gun a bit because right now we're not even talking about a solution and about mediation and what will happen when that happens. Right now, the West is saying that India should be much more critical of Russia, full stop, because of these principles of sovereignty, of territorial integrity that India is constantly talking about otherwise vis-a-vis the Kashmir question. So why not pay the West a compliment by saying, I mean, this is not the West being critical of India on the revocation of Article 370, but saying, hey, why don't you put your money where your mouth is and criticize Russia for doing the same thing that you want us to support India on, which is, for example, on the territorial integrity question in Kashmir. So the answer to that is that the reason India has been not so critical of Vladimir Putin is an old answer. It's more than a year old, and everybody knows. It's because India is dependent on its energy supplies on Russia. And over the last year, bilateral trade between India and Russia has gone up to more than $38 billion, a huge increase. And most of it is because of the oil, the cheap oil that India has been sourcing from Russia. Why has it been sourcing this cheap oil when the Americans are putting sanctions on all those who are buying Russian oil? Is because India's 1.4 billion population, a vast majority of them very poor and very, very sensitive to fluctuations in oil prices. And imagine if the oil price goes beyond what it is right now. Imagine if it touches $100 a barrel. The whole economy, not just India's economy, but the global economy would go through the roof. So, in a sense, the Indian government should perhaps argue is that we're helping the West by keeping the price of Russian oil down. So India getting very cheap Russian oil, managing to stay afloat these past few years as it came off the back of COVID. And if that's not national interest, then what else is? So I think these foreign policy analysts must understand that national interest stems from your own interest, from self-love. Self-love first, and then other people. Of course, the Americans are unhappy that India is, in a sense, violating the sanctions that the West has imposed. Remember that these are not UN sanctions, but Western sanctions. But let me also ask you this question. The Japanese have now announced that they are going to buy Russian oil. Not just that, they have announced that they're going to break the $60 cap that had been imposed by the US and by other Western nations, but primarily the US. $60 a barrel oil was the cap that these Western nations had put so as to limit the amount of revenues that Vladimir Putin was earning from the sale of Russia's oil and gas abroad. But guess who's broken that rule, that sanction, that mandate? Japan, which is a very close ally of the US. In fact, its closest ally. So when your own allies break ground, it obviously means that the ground beneath your feet is shifting. So why blame India for doing something in its national interest and not castigate the Japanese when they're doing it on in their national interest? So certainly you can also say that over the last year, the Americans have come a really long way. Earlier, the criticism was in private, but now it has been pushed behind doors, behind the parda. But it is there, dear viewer. And at the Trilateral Commission meeting, which is an informal think tank, a very powerful and influential one, nevertheless, they met in March in Delhi. And there, again, Western speakers were critical about the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the fact that India is not saying anything about it. There is a concern here, though, which is that this could escalate. Right now, it is still controlled. Jaishankar's comments criticizing the West being critical of India's domestic politics, whether about Rahul Gandhi or otherwise. In the past, we have seen that there has been a lot of criticism on the Kashmir question, on the lynching of Muslims, basically on India's socio-economic parameters, or primarily social parameters under the Narendra Modi government. So the question that if this escalates, if this snowballs and the foreign media continues to write very critical things about the Modi government, then it's par for the course that these governments will also ask questions, because a lot of independent reporting that the foreign media does is used as analysis for these governments to base their policies on. But I would also argue that both India and the US, while they're having this bad moment right now, must understand one thing, which is that when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. But in this particular case, when elephants fight over a piece of cheese, guess who gets to keep the cheese, or guess who actually eats the cheese and lets these two elephants fight? And that's China. So remember that it's China that's going to be the victor of this whole game playing if India and the US do not sort out their problems quickly enough. The US is arguably India's most important relationship. There is none that is more. But having said that, the Americans must be much more understanding of where India is coming from, its unique civilization status, and the fact that it wants to stand up and assert its own place in the world, not necessarily be a lackey to someone else. And that the Americans, indeed everybody, must learn to appreciate. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I do look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you again.